Hi, everyone. We're here with Franci Duran, director of Tales from My Childhood. That's the opening film of the screening that you'll be watching in the People's Revolt. Franci, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody for watching this screening.
Awesome. Franci, I would love to know a little bit about Tales from My Childhood and uh, when did you make this film and what made you um, create this piece?
I made Tales from My Childhood in my early 20s when I was at university at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Um, it was like a reading class. So I just going to talk a little bit about the program that I was in because it allowed the structure of the film program at Queen's University allowed me to make the film in the particular form that I did. So it was a very I studied film at Queen's in the sort of the latter half of the 1980s. And the film department was it's not a production program. It was a theory program that had production courses, and it was very loose in the sense that it wasn't a sort of the conservative model. Sorry, not conservative, the conservatory model
Mm-hmm.
of filmmaking. So that
Mm-hmm.
I know we were taught the conventions of filmmaking, but I never felt the need to follow them. So that's what I mean
Mm,
by it was the freedom. And at the time we were also, it was a very young faculty. It was a young department at the time.
mm-hmm.
And we were shown a lot of experimental work, primarily from North America and from the United States and Canada. So, and we watched a lot of films, a lot of primarily narratives and documentaries from Europe
Mm-hmm.
as well. So it was kind of at the time also it was a time of postmodernism and identity politics. And so it's kind of in that landscape that I
Mm-hmm.
learned to make work. And at the same time, I myself was wanting to give voice to my experience that I'd had and my family had, and many other Chileans who had to leave um, Chile and the experience of exile after. So it was the beginning of that exploration for myself. It was the beginning of my formation as an artist. So all those things melded together. So that's the very traumatic story, and I know that my family's trauma was not as, our story is not as difficult as many others because we were able to leave. But I wanted to give voice to that as an artist.
That's great. It's a great introduction to for people to know where everyone's coming from. Because I, put this screen together as an experimental film screening, and certainly when you watch your film, you feel like you're in that realm of things of the experimental filmmaking. And yeah, is there any from that introduction that you gave us and a little bit about the background of your work.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us if you had any filmmakers that were inspiring you to do that kind of work? Were you like
Mm-hmm.
thinking of anybody in particular?
Yes, when I made Tales from My Childhood, I was very influenced by Canadian filmmakers, what is now called the Escarpment School, who work in the method which is now called process-oriented cinema, which is that you still obviously follow you follow, when you make a film, there's always some pre-production and production and post-production process, but with process-oriented film making, you're not necessarily doing it in that order, right? So it was a very intuitive process. And so filmmakers that inspired me were Philip Hoffman, Midi Onodera, Helen Lee, Anne-Marie Fleming, Patricia Grubin. These are all Canadians. Mike Hoolboom, who were making work at that time, and I was very influenced by them, by their approach to the material, both in terms of as understanding it as a tactile media, and also understanding it as that communication didn't have to follow sort of a convention, a conventional method of address, a very didactic process, which I guess I associate with fiction filmmaking, even though I love fiction films.
Something that's very beautiful about your film is the narration part of it.
Mm-hmm.
There is something about your voice in the film that really keeps us in this capsule of memory. And I just want to talk to you about how did you find that narration, the way you present the film, the way you tell the story. And well, you present it as a tale, right? Tales from my childhood. And how did you decide to have this as the driving force of the film?
As I mentioned before, I was very influenced by the Escarpment School, which used the voice and a personal voice, personal narration as an anchoring point, I suppose, in the kind of that diaristic approach. Well, it's obviously influenced by filmmakers like Chris Marker too. So I began, when I made the film, I actually had a sort of a script, and it was very linear. So it was like this happened, and then this happened, and then we did this, and we suffered that. And then I read it when I was recording it. I'm not an actor. I don't have a trained voice. So it was all very new to me and quite scary, actually, both in terms of the emotional content, but also just the physical act of recording your voice if you don't know how to do it. So I read my entire narration, but then when I was editing, and as I mentioned, it's done on analog film, and then when you're editing sound, you had all these soundtracks and so it was just the act of physically removing, like cutting it out. And so for me, the narration was really a process of distillation. So I was actually writing as I was editing the sound as well. So I think maybe that's, looking back on the film, one of the things I like about it is just that I was just trying to distill it into the most essential components of story as led by a voice, a human voice.
I really love the way, I mean, one of the reasons why I was thinking of opening with this film is precisely that. It's how this voice is so, it's telling us a really difficult story, personal story, but at the same time, it's welcoming us to this space, to kind of preparing us for the journey. So I really appreciated that about your film. This is why it is the opening film. It's a really nice way to introduce us into this world, something that we're about to see. How did you feel when I invited you to the People's Revolt with this film? Knowing that you had made it so long ago too, and
yeah, I mean, it's yeah, that's an interesting question. Okay, and I'll do my best with it. Well, of course, I was honored. I'm always happy when I always feel very honored when any of my work gets screened, and I really enjoy. I enjoy seeing, and I think it's also important to have the context expanded, the context it's which one imagines as an artist and which work might be seen, but then once it's out there, it actually belongs to the world, right? However small the the audience may be for experimental film. So it was an honor for me. I hadn't really considered it in terms of the protests that were happening in Chile, because I haven't lived in Chile since I was 6 years old. So my experience of Chile is a distant one. And like many exiles, it's, you live in a world where you both belong. You might belong in one or two or more places, and then you don't belong in any of them. So it's this, so I was a little bit nervous to see it, and people might perceive it as being maybe not broad enough in terms of its critique or its reach, which certainly, as a film of a young filmmaker, it's very rooted in a very young voice and it might just not include as many voices which need to be heard. So it was really, I really enjoyed the screening for that, just to get mine and Cecilia's films at the beginning, setting up at a certain time, and then the multitude of voices that come after, and having grown up in a different time in a country that has not just the history of the protests, of the recent protests, but a long history of the violence that settled the country as well. So yeah, those are some of the things I thought when you invited me.
That's nice.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really liked about having you and Cecilia, and other filmmakers that have a longer career, like Malena Schlam, for instance, or even Nicolas Rubchik,
and Eddie.
And Eddie, yes.
Yeah.
It's the fact that I had so many young filmmakers too in the program. There some of the pieces that are shorter that came from the call from Caos Germen, which is the collective in Chile that was gathering all this short films. By the way, I have something with the light that's going on, so I hope it doesn't bother you, everyone.
No.
But it's precisely that. I really like the fact that we were having different generations, but also the fact that these younger generations of Chilean filmmakers were able to see yours and Cecilia's and Malena's work, that maybe they don't have that access. And it's something that, well, I haven't been in Chile for almost 8 years by now, but by the time when I was in Chile and when I was studying film and all these other things, I didn't have the opportunity to watch your work or the work of Cecilia or Malena's when I was in school. And I feel like this screening has allowed this young artist to see the work of other Chileans, experimental filmmakers who are out there making beautiful, awesome work. And because we're so, film school in every part of the world, it gets gets mostly the industry work. So that was something that was really valuable for me from the screening. And I know by talking to them that some of these younger filmmakers were really excited to be able to screen with you guys, especially those that are really into experimental cinema and somehow have been able to work their way through other films and have been able to get to those other films, which is always for me very impressive, because it was almost impossible for me to get there before I came to the US to study film properly and to go to a school where we had experimental filmmakers.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about Double Negative Collective?
One thing, just drawing back to what you were saying, I think film school is very insular, and I think even now it's still obviously guided by conventional methods of address. But I think now also experimental film, at least in North America and probably in Europe, which is I'm just not familiar with the pedagogy in Europe, is expanding more, and definitely there's more screens even right now, if they're all online, for experimental work, which is really nice. So I don't know about the Double Negative Collective here in Toronto. I have worked, my professional development beyond school has been at artist-run production centers, and the ones that I know the best and I'm most familiar with are LIFT, the Liaison of Independent Filmmakers of Toronto, which actually has international artist residencies that other artists might be interested in applying for. Obviously once restrictions lift. And then also Gallery 44, which is a photography collective, and then the Toronto Animated Image Society. There's others as well, but those are the ones that I've gotten most of my professional development from, and where I've grown community and met many other artists who are working in similar ways.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I asked you is because I got to you through Double Negative Collective.
Okay.
I reached out to them, and they told me about your work, and this is how I got to your work. So I'm really thankful that they were able to put me in touch with you. So this is why I asked you. Yeah, I met them a long time ago in 2014 when I had a screening of Double Negative Collective at my school at the time when I was in my master's program, and we had a screening. And this is how I met Eddie, and this is how I met Malena's work. So when I began to reach out to Chilean filmmakers, I immediately thought of Double Negative, and they also told me about your work. So I'm just really glad that they did, because I was really happy to encounter your work.
Thank you. And thank you to them too.
Yes.
I mean, we know each other because there's not that many
yes.
Chilean experimental filmmakers. I mean, you named almost all of them, right?
I know. No, it is exciting. Super exciting.
Yeah.
So going a little bit back to what was going on in October in Chile, how did you live that in Canada, or where were you at the time when it happened?
I was living in Toronto, which is where I live now. And it was very, well, I found it both necessary and moving and upsetting and hard to watch, and actually hard to make sense of what was going on, because how I was receiving it was mostly through the mainstream media. And it was covered very little by the Canadian press. A little bit more so by the New York Times, and so I had very little access to what was going on, and I know for my parents it was quite. They lived a little bit of PTSD because of the coup, and so they had the Chilean media on all the time, and they were talking to friends all the time and family. And I mean, the thing is, it's as a Canadian, having grown up as a Canadian Chilean, it's very hard for me. I mean, I intellectually I understand it, but emotionally it's hard for me to understand why the economic changes weren't made once the country was returned to democracy, and why the myths were allowed to perpetuate that, Chile was doing so well, and everybody was doing so well, and that look at the transition to democracy was a fair and equal one for everybody, because it's obvious that even as a visitor back to Chile, that was not the case. So I saw it as a necessary. I saw it as necessary and a good thing, and I hoped that some equality might come out in the process. Now, as we're living in this very unusual time, I'm worried, and I'm hopeful that some of the changes that the protests were starting to give light to, I'm hopeful that some of them might still come to fruition and not be forgotten.
That's a really nice thought, because a lot of us are also very concerned that that might not happen, especially with the pandemic and how things have turned out, and kind of like how the movement stopped because of the pandemic. I was able to go to Chile in December and film and do some shooting with the Bolex, and there was still so much going on, especially because of Christmas time and New Year's. There were huge manifestations, people going out in the streets, and so the feeling of it was that it was still going on. It was still, people were still out in the streets, even though there were out in the streets for
Mm-hmm.
so long. I mean, it has a lot of resistance to go out in the street and ask, demand something to the
Mm-hmm.
government. It's a resistance kind of effort. Like, you're there and you know that it's going to be a long time before anything changes. How is your experience as a filmmaker,
Mm-hmm.
right? Living in exile because your parents had to
Mm-hmm.
leave the country. You were so young when that happened. And how do you, I mean, it's clear what you did in Tales from a Childhood, but I just
Mm-hmm.
want to know, like, how do you deal with that experience with your filmmaking?
Um, well, I mean, it's interesting because as an artist, really, what I think many of us want to do is just go and make work and not have to worry about like contextualize it and just explore the various forms and the various media and the ideas as gleaned through this process of discovery. But the truth is you need to present a bio and you need to kind of frame your work somehow. And so one of the things that I say is that my work, all of my work, no matter what topic I'm dealing with, it has to do with history, memory, and violence. And I think that that's an appropriate encapsulation of what I do as to whether I'm dealing with the violence of state over citizen, or settlers over indigenous peoples, or humans over other than human species, that the violences that we impose daily, and without meaning to and without noticing most of the time. So, and I think that that comes from my early experiences with it's just it's like a violent leaving of place, and then having grown up hearing these stories of of violence and suffering, and without actually resolution for even after all this time for many of the disappeared and the people who were tortured in Chile, of that time, and not to mention the centuries of violence against indigenous peoples in Chile.
It's
Yeah.
a really nice way to frame your work, and um, something that I really like about your work, and I would love to also show you your other work too,
Mm-hmm.
as well, in other programs, because you sent me a couple of links, and
Mm-hmm.
it was really nice to get a sense of what you do.
I,
And yeah,
actually, just to backtrack to
yep.
one of your other questions, is in 2019, and was the first time that any of my films have been shown in Chile, and they showed Traje de Luces, Suit of Lights,
Mm-hmm.
at the experimental festival in Valparaiso, and it also showed in a documentary screening at a festival in Talca. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so besides this screening, this is
Wow.
yeah.
Well, this is part of what I was saying at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, is how hard it is to get to that work.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes one person to show that work at a screening,
Mm-hmm.
or wanting to do something with in my case, with other Chilean
Mm-hmm.
experimental filmmakers. And it had been a question for me, and some kind of urgency for me, as soon as I started making my own work,
Mm-hmm.
like 5 years ago, when I started to make my own experimental films. I was always thinking, in the back of my mind, I need to connect with other experimental
Mm-hmm.
Chilean filmmakers, and I was able to connect with a lab in Santiago that's
Mm-hmm.
fairly new.
Great.
Yeah. So
Yay.
yes, Space Ocho is their name.
Okay.
And yeah, so I brought film from my collective in Boston.
Okay.
When
Nice.
I was in Boston,
Mm-hmm.
AGX Film Collective, I brought like 10 films and in their cans.
Mm-hmm.
So I traveled with the cans to Santiago, and I had a screening of the work of the AGX Film Collective in an
Great.
effort to connect this lab with my lab and my collective. but also in an effort to bring this cinema, this kind of filmmaking to Chile and get some work from them as well. So this effort to exchange and also to reach out and also to meet all these other experimental filmmakers that are out there in the world. I appreciate you having the time to talk with me in this forum. In a way, the pandemic has forced us to do things online, but at the same time, I feel like we have been able to reach out to people who are in different parts of the world more easily. So I really appreciate you being here today to talk to us a little bit about Tales from My Childhood, Your Cinema, and the People's Revolt. Is there anything else you would like to share with everyone today?
Just wanted to reiterate my thanks to you for programming the work and for curating such a moving and important and actually very broad program. It flows beautifully, and I also thought, I don't think I've told you this, but I thought your film was very also moving and beautiful. And thank you for all your work, both as a programmer and as an artist, and all the other artists in the program too.
Thank you so much, Franci. And yeah, as I said, I would love to show your work in other programs and keep supporting your work because it's beautiful. And I really also encourage people who are watching the program today to look for Franci Duran's work and look for the work of all the filmmakers in the screening, but Franci's in particular, because you have such a long career. And I think it's very important for people to, whenever you're encountering a program with so many different films, I think it's really nice to start researching about every filmmaker and check their work. I've seen that you've been showing stuff online. What is your next screening or program?
I have there's a program of Latin America of films by Canadian artists who are also Latin American at the Vancouver Latin American Film Festival. It's free. It's running right now until the middle of September. And your upcoming screening now, and I'm also showing some work at Cine in October, which is Cine, which is the Toronto Latin American Film Festival, and actually there's going to be a panel of Canadian Latinx artists.
That's awesome
on that. So yeah, those are two places.
That's great. That's great. So that everyone can watch this and continue to appreciate your work and the work of all other Latin American filmmakers in the world. Thank you so much, Franci.
Yeah, thank you too. Thank you so much.
All right.